My family invited me to dinner after 3 years of silence, then handed me a $38,000 bill. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner table, I need you to answer one question honestly. If your family cut you off for 3 years and then called you out of nowhere with 6 words, dinner tonight, we need to talk, would you go? I did. And by the end of that night, I would find out that the invitation had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with forgiveness, and everything to do with the signature they needed on a piece of paper. My signature. One I never gave them. My mother hadn't spoken to me in 3 years. Not because I had abandoned her. Not because I had stolen anything. Not because I had done something so terrible that a mother would have no choice but to cut her own daughter out of her life. She stopped speaking to me because I refused to pay for something I had never agreed to buy. 3 years later, on a Thursday afternoon, she called me. I almost didn't answer. Her name appeared on my phone at 4:17 p.m., and I stared at it until the screen went dark. Then it lit up again. Mom. I hadn't seen that name on my screen in years. My thumb hovered over the answer button. Part of me wanted to hear her voice. Another part of me remembered the last thing she'd said to me. If you walk out that door, don't expect this family to be here when you come back. I had walked out. And I hadn't come back. Not once. The phone stopped ringing. 30 seconds later, a text appeared. Dinner tonight. 7 p.m. Your father's house. We need to talk. Please come alone. I read it 3 times. No apology. No explanation. Just dinner. After 3 years of silence. I should have deleted it. Instead, I went. And I want you to remember that decision, because everything that follows happened only because I walked through that door. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, my entire family was sitting around the dining table. My mother, my father, my older brother Daniel, my younger sister Emily, even my Aunt Susan, who lived 2 states away and hadn't spoken to me since the argument. There were candles on the table, my mother's good china, a bottle of wine, and 6 place settings. They had prepared a dinner like we were celebrating something. My mother stood when I walked in. She smiled. That frightened me more than if she'd been angry. You're here, she said. I said I would come. My father nodded. Daniel looked away. Emily gave me a small smile. Nobody mentioned the 3 years. Nobody mentioned the last argument. Nobody mentioned why I had been excluded from birthdays, holidays, weddings, and funerals. My mother simply pulled out the chair beside her. Sit down, Rachel. So I sat. For the first 20 minutes, we pretended we were a normal family. We talked about the weather, my father's garden, Emily's new job, Daniel's children. Nobody asked about my life. Nobody asked where I'd been. Nobody asked whether I was happy. I remember thinking, halfway through that small talk, that something felt staged, rehearsed. Like everyone at that table had agreed on a script before I arrived, and I was the only one who hadn't read it. And then my mother placed a folder on the table. She slid it toward me. There's something we need you to take care of. I looked at the folder. Then at her. What is it? Open it. I did. The first page was an invoice. My eyes went straight to the number at the bottom. $38,742.16. I thought I'd misunderstood it. I turned the page. Another invoice. Then another. Hotel. Catering. Venue. Photography. Flowers. Transportation. Legal fees. And at the bottom of the final page. Total amount due, $38,742.16. I looked up. Nobody was eating anymore. My father folded his hands on the table. Daniel stared at his plate. Emily looked nervous. My mother took a slow breath. We need you to pay this. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes your brain laughs when reality becomes too absurd to process. Pay what? The bill. I can see that. It's a family expense. No. My mother blinked. What? I said no. The room became completely silent. My father leaned forward. Rachel, don't make this difficult. I looked at him. You invited me here after 3 years of not speaking to me, handed me a $38,000 bill, and you're surprised I'm asking questions? My mother reached for the folder. We're not asking you to pay the whole thing immediately. I stared at her. That's not what I asked. She hesitated. The bill is connected to the wedding. Whose wedding? Emily looked at me. Mine. I turned toward my sister. You got married? She lowered her eyes. 6 months ago. I felt something inside me go very still. 6 months. I had been excluded from my own sister's wedding. And now they wanted me to pay for it. I pushed the folder back across the table. You have the wrong person. My father shook his head. No, we don't. You invited me to dinner to collect money for a wedding I wasn't invited to? My mother said quietly. You were invited. I stared at her. No, I wasn't. You were. Mom, I didn't receive an invitation. It was sent. Where? She didn't answer. Daniel finally spoke. It was complicated. I turned toward him. What's complicated about mailing an invitation? Nobody answered. And that's when I understood something that changed the entire tone of the evening. The bill wasn't the real reason they had called me. The bill was only the thing they wanted me to see first. There was something else in that folder. Something they were afraid to tell me, something so buried in paperwork that they were counting on me never finding it. But I did. I reached for the folder again. And this time I opened every page. The first invoice was for the wedding venue. $12,500. The second was catering. $9,840. Photography. $4,600. Flowers. $2,175. Hotel rooms. $3,400. Transportation. $1,800. Then there were smaller charges. Tips. Service fees. Overtime. A cancellation fee. A replacement cake. Everything added up to $38,742.16. I looked at my mother. Why is my name on this? Her face changed. Only slightly. But I noticed. Because, she said, you agreed to be responsible for the family account. I felt my stomach drop. What family account? My father answered. The account your grandmother left. I stared at him. My grandmother died 4 years ago. We know. You told me there was no money. My mother's eyes moved toward my father. And suddenly I understood why they had stopped speaking to me 3 years ago. It wasn't because I had betrayed them. It wasn't because I had abandoned them. It was because I had asked one question they didn't want answered. Where had my grandmother's money gone? 3 years earlier, I'd asked. My family had told me to stop digging. I hadn't. And now they were sitting across from me with a $38,000 bill and a story that didn't add up, one that was about to unravel faster than any of them expected. I closed the folder. Start talking. My father sighed. Your grandmother wanted the family to stay together. No. She wanted her money protected. Same thing. No, Dad. It isn't. My mother looked at me. You always make everything about money. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. You invited me here. Because we need your help. You haven't spoken to me in 3 years. Because you hurt this family. I looked at her. By asking where Grandma's money went? Her lips tightened. You know what you did. No. I leaned back. I actually don't. And for the first time that night, nobody had an answer. Because the truth was simple. They had expected me to come to dinner ashamed. They had expected me to apologize. They had expected me to see the $38,742 bill, feel guilty, and quietly write a check. They didn't expect me to ask where the money had gone. They certainly didn't expect me to remember everything. But I remembered. I remembered the night my grandmother died. I remembered the envelope she gave me 2 weeks before her funeral. And most importantly, I remembered what she told me not to do. Rachel, whatever happens, don't let them convince you that silence is the same thing as peace. At the time, I didn't understand. 3 years later, sitting at that dinner table, I finally did. My grandmother had known. She knew exactly what my family was capable of. And she had left me something. Not money. Evidence. I just didn't know where I'd put it. Not yet. But I was about to find out, and what it revealed would turn a family dinner into a criminal case. 3 years earlier, my grandmother had been the center of our family. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She was 78 when she died. She wasn't rich in the way people imagine rich people. She didn't own a mansion. She didn't drive an expensive car. She lived in the same brick house for 46 years. But she was careful. Very careful. She saved everything. Receipts, bank statements, tax documents, insurance policies, old letters. She even kept handwritten notes from grocery shopping trips. My mother used to joke about it. Mom keeps paperwork for everything. Grandma would smile and say, "Paper remembers better than people." I thought it was just one of her strange sayings. I understand it now. She had 3 children. My mother, Linda, my uncle Robert, and my Aunt Susan. My mother was the oldest. She had always believed that meant she was in charge. My uncle Robert lived nearby. He was successful, owned a construction company, and had a habit of making every conversation about what he had achieved. My Aunt Susan lived farther away. She rarely got involved in family arguments, which is exactly why her presence at that dinner table should have told me something was different this time. And then there was me, Rachel, the daughter who apparently asked too many questions. I was never the favorite. That distinction belonged to my brother Daniel. My parents had always treated him differently. When he needed money, they helped. When he bought his first house, Dad gave him money for the down payment. When he started his business, Mom called everyone and asked them to support him. When his first business failed, they called it bad luck. When my small business struggled one year, they called it irresponsibility. I learned early that fairness wasn't something my family practiced. It was something they talked about. But Grandma was different. She didn't care who was the oldest. She didn't care who had the better job. She didn't care who had the bigger house. She treated all of us the same. Maybe that's why my mother never fully trusted her. The conflict became worse after Grandma was diagnosed with heart failure. She started organizing her affairs. One evening, she asked me to come over. I remember sitting at her kitchen table. There were 2 cups of tea between us, a yellow legal pad, and a thick blue folder. She pushed the folder toward me. "I want you to know something." "What?" "If something happens to me, don't let anyone rush you." I laughed. "Grandma, you're not dying tomorrow." She smiled. "I know." Then she became serious. "Your mother will tell you everything is already handled." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Listen to me." She placed her hand over mine. "If they ask you to sign anything, don't." "Who?" "Anyone." She looked toward the window. "Especially if they're telling you it's just paperwork." I remember feeling confused. "Why are you telling me this?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Because you are the only one who has ever asked me what I actually wanted." That sentence stayed with me longer than I realized at the time. Looking back, I think it was the moment she decided something, a decision that, years later, would sit waiting for me in a storage unit I had almost forgotten existed. 2 weeks later, she died in her sleep. And everything changed. The funeral was beautiful. My mother handled everything. The flowers, the church, the food, the guest list, the announcements. She acted like the perfect grieving daughter. Everyone praised her. "Linda has been so strong. Linda has done everything. Your mother is holding the family together." I watched her receive every compliment. And I said nothing. After the funeral, the family gathered at Grandma's house. My mother stood in the living room with a folder. "We need to go through her things." I asked about the will. She said, "Everything is simple." "What does that mean?" "Her house goes to the 3 children equally." "What about the savings?" My mother looked at me. "There's not much." That was the first lie. I didn't know it yet. But it was the first of many, and I wouldn't understand the full shape of it until I was sitting in a bank parking lot 3 years later with my hands shaking on a stack of transaction records. Grandma had told me months earlier that she had approximately $180,000 in a personal savings account, separate from the larger estate trust she'd quietly built over decades from a life insurance payout and an old investment account nobody in the family knew the full size of. She had never told even me the complete number. She only ever said, "It's enough to matter and enough to cause a fight." She was right about both. So when my mother said there's not much, the numbers didn't make sense. So I asked. My mother became angry. "Why are you interrogating me?" "I'm not." "You don't trust your own mother?" "I trust Grandma." Silence. That was the moment everything started. 3 months later, my mother stopped inviting me to family dinners. Then birthdays. Then holidays. My brother stopped answering my calls. My father said I was creating unnecessary conflict. I asked for the financial records. Nobody gave them to me. Then one evening, my mother called. Stop. Stop what? Stop asking questions. Why? Because you're destroying this family. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone. I didn't destroy anything. You know exactly what you're doing. No, Mom. I want to know where Grandma's money went. She hung up. 3 days later, I received an email. One sentence. You are no longer welcome in this family until you learn to respect boundaries. That was 3 years ago. I never responded. And for 3 years, there was silence. Until the dinner. Until the bill. Until the folder. And until I understood exactly why they had waited 3 years to call me back, because it had taken them 3 years to build a paper trail clean enough that they thought I'd never question it. They were wrong. I looked across the table at my parents. Where is the inheritance? My mother looked confused. What inheritance? Grandma's money. My father shifted in his chair. Rachel, this is exactly why we didn't want to contact you. Because I ask questions? Because you refuse to let the past go. The past is $38,000. Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back. This is ridiculous. I looked at him. Did you know about the bill? He didn't answer. Daniel? Yes. Did you know I wasn't invited to Emily's wedding? He looked down. Yes. I nodded. Did you know they were planning to ask me for the money? Another silence. Yes. Something inside me hurt. Not because of the bill. Because of him. Daniel had been my older brother. We weren't always close, but when we were children, he was the person who protected me. When Dad yelled, Daniel would distract him. When Mom punished me, Daniel would sneak food into my room. I had believed there was still something between us. Apparently, there wasn't. I looked at Emily. Did you know? Her eyes filled with tears. Yes. Why? She whispered. I didn't know what else to do. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I looked back at my mother. Who signed the wedding contracts? She hesitated. Your father. Then why is my name on the bill? Because the original family account was under your name. I froze. My name? Yes. Show me. She pushed another document toward me. I read it. At first, I didn't understand. Then I saw the signature. Rachel Ellis. My signature. Except it wasn't mine. The letters were close. Very close. But I knew my own handwriting. Someone had forged my signature. I looked at my father. Who did this? He said nothing. I looked at my mother. Nothing. Daniel stood up. I can't do this. I pointed at the chair. Sit down. He stared at me. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my brother's face. He sat. I turned the document over. There was a date. 2 years ago. A year after my family stopped speaking to me. That meant one thing. Someone had used my name while I was completely cut off from them, while I had no way of knowing, no way of checking, no way of stopping it. And that $38,742 bill wasn't just a family expense. It was connected to a financial account in my name. An account I had never opened. I looked at my mother. How long have you been doing this? She started crying. My father stood. Enough. No. I stood too. Not enough. I picked up the folder. I'm done being the person you blame for asking questions. My father pointed toward the door. Then leave. I looked at him. I will. I put the folder into my bag. But I'm taking this with me. My mother's crying stopped. Instantly. Like someone had flipped a switch. You can't. Why? She didn't answer. But her reaction told me more than any document in that folder could have. A mother who has nothing to hide does not stop crying the second her daughter reaches for evidence. And that's when I knew. The documents were the real reason they had invited me. The bill was bait. The signature was the trap. And whatever was behind that account was bigger than $38,742. Big enough that my mother's fear had, for one unguarded second, looked exactly like guilt. I walked out. But I didn't go home. I drove straight to the bank. Except the bank was already closed. So I sat outside in the dark in my car with a folder full of secrets on the passenger seat, and I made a decision that would change everything that came after I opened it. The bank was closed. It was 9:15 p.m. So I sat in my car and opened every document I'd taken. The first page showed an account number. The second showed transaction history. I scrolled. There were dozens of payments. Some small, some large. Hotels, restaurants, home improvement stores, online purchases, a jewelry store, a luxury furniture company. And then I saw something that made my hands go cold. A transfer. $62,000. 3 years ago. The same week Grandma died. The recipient wasn't my mother. It wasn't my father. It wasn't Daniel. At least, not directly. It was a company. Ellis Family Holdings, LLC. I searched the name on my phone. It existed. Registered in our state. The managing member was Daniel Ellis. My brother. I stared at the screen. Daniel hadn't just known about the wedding bill. He had been quietly running money through an account connected to my name for years, and I had no idea any of it existed. But why? And where had the money come from? I opened another document. There was the answer. A transfer from an estate account. Grandma's estate. I felt sick. My mother had told me there wasn't much money left. Grandma's personal savings alone had been roughly $180,000. But this document referenced something bigger. A consolidated estate trust totaling $214,600, built from her savings plus a life insurance payout and an old investment account she'd never fully disclosed to anyone but her attorney. An account my mother either didn't know about or knew about and buried. I kept scrolling. Another transfer. $35,000. Another. $18,500. Another. $12,000. I added the numbers. They exceeded $100,000. My grandmother's money hadn't disappeared. It had been moved, piece by piece, and my name had been used to authorize it. I didn't sleep that night. At 6:40 a.m., I called an attorney. His name was Michael Grant. I had never met him before, but he had handled financial fraud cases. I sent him photographs of the documents. He called me back at 8:12. Rachel, where did you get these? My family. Did you sign any of this? No. Are you certain? Yes. Then don't contact them again. My stomach tightened. Why? Because if this is what it looks like, they're going to know you found something. They already know. No. He paused. They know you have the bill. They don't know I found the transfers. Good. Why? Because now we have an advantage they don't know we have. That was the first time anyone had used that word. Advantage. Until then, I had thought I was fighting my family. I hadn't realized I might be fighting something much bigger, and that whoever had built this scheme had almost certainly built a plan for what to do if I ever came looking. Fraud, forgery, estate misappropriation, and possibly identity theft. Michael asked me to meet him that afternoon. I brought everything. He spread the documents across his desk. Then he asked me one question I hadn't thought to ask myself. Where is the original will? I don't know. Find it. Why? Because your grandmother was careful. You told me that. She was. Then if she knew this could happen, she probably left instructions somewhere no one else thought to look. I thought about the blue folder. The one she'd given me. The one I'd searched for after she died but couldn't find. I remembered something. A sentence. Paper remembers better than people. I went home. I opened every box in my closet. Old tax returns. School records. Receipts. Photographs. Nothing. Then I remembered the storage unit. I hadn't opened it in years. It was where I'd put things from Grandma's house after my mother told me to take whatever I wanted, a gesture that, at the time, I thought was kindness. Now I understood it might have been carelessness. My mother had let me take boxes she never bothered to check. I drove there. The storage unit was almost completely forgotten. I unlocked it. Dust covered everything. Old furniture. Boxes. Christmas decorations. A sewing machine. Then I saw it. A small blue folder. Exactly like the one Grandma had shown me. My hands started shaking. I opened it. Inside was a copy of her will. But there was more. A letter. My name was written on the front. Rachel. Open only if they turn you against each other. I sat on the floor of that storage unit, surrounded by boxes nobody else had thought to search, and I read a letter my grandmother had written for a moment she hoped would never come. Rachel, if you're reading this, something happened that I hoped wouldn't. Your mother will tell you I was confused. Your father will tell you that family matters should stay private. Daniel will tell you that he never meant to hurt anyone. And perhaps all of them will tell you that I would have wanted you to forgive. Maybe they're right. But forgiveness without truth is only another form of silence. I have watched my children fight over money for years. I have watched them compete over who deserves more. I have watched them take things from each other and call it help. But the greatest mistake I made was believing that if I divided my estate equally, they would behave equally. I was wrong. There is money. More than your mother knows. There are accounts she does not know about. And there is one account I created specifically so that no one could empty the estate before everything was settled. I put you on that account because you are the only person in this family who has never asked me for money. If they tell you that you owe them anything, check the records first. If they tell you that you signed something, compare the signature. And if they tell you that keeping quiet will protect the family, remember this. Silence protects the person who benefits from the secret. It rarely protects the person being hurt by it. One more thing, and I need you to read this part twice. If this letter has found you, it means someone in this family broke a promise they made to me before I died. I won't tell you who asked me for money in my final year, because I want you to find that answer yourself in the records, without my voice telling you what to believe. Trust the paper, Rachel. Not the person crying the loudest. I love you. Grandma. I read it twice. Then a third time. At the bottom was a bank account number. And a handwritten note. Ask for the complete estate ledger. I called Michael. He answered immediately. I found it. There was a pause. Found what? The account. And a letter. How much? I don't know yet. Don't touch it. I'm not. Good. Then he said, Rachel, we need to move quickly. And there's something else you should prepare yourself for. What? If someone in your family broke a promise to your grandmother before she died, the person who forged your signature might not be the only one responsible. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. Because up until that moment, I had assumed I already knew who the villain of this story was. I was about to find out I was wrong about how many there were. The next week became a blur of bank statements, legal documents, phone calls, and questions. Michael requested the estate records. The bank confirmed that Grandma had maintained a consolidated trust containing $214,600 shortly before her death, her $180,000 personal savings, plus a life insurance payout and an investment account she'd never disclosed to my mother. The account had been transferred into an estate trust. Then, according to the records, several withdrawals had been authorized. Some were legitimate. Most weren't. And the largest transfers went to the company controlled by Daniel. But the strangest part was still my name. My signature appeared on documents authorizing several transactions. Except I had been living in another city at the time. I had proof. My apartment lease. Work records. Credit card transactions. Even a hospital record from one date when I had been with my father after an accident. I couldn't have signed those documents. Someone had forged them. Michael sent the evidence to a forensic document examiner. 2 days later, we got the report. The signatures were not mine. They were traced simulations. The examiner couldn't tell us who had physically created them. But he could tell us something else. The same person had likely created all of them. That changed everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a family dispute. It was deliberate, coordinated, and repeated over more than 2 years. I asked Michael why. He looked at the documents. Because if you pay the bill, they can argue you accepted responsibility for the account. Retroactively. In writing. I felt cold. They wanted me to sign. Probably. Why? To clean up the paper trail. I stared at him. They were going to make me pay for my own forgery. That's what it looks like. I sat back. For 3 years, I had believed my family had rejected me because they thought I was difficult. Now I realized something much worse. They hadn't pushed me away because I was difficult. They pushed me away because I was dangerous to their secret. I had asked the wrong question, and they had spent 3 years making sure I stopped asking it. But Grandma's letter kept pulling at me. Someone in this family broke a promise she made before she died. I hadn't asked who yet. I was about to. Before that confrontation, though, there was one night I haven't told anyone about until now. It was 2 days after I found the blue folder in the storage unit. I was still sitting with everything: the letter, the account number, the words "someone in this family broke a promise" repeating in my head, when there was a knock at my apartment door at almost 11 at night. I looked through the peephole. Daniel. I almost didn't open it, but something told me it was better to know what he wanted than to spend the night wondering. He looked terrible. Unshaven, exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Can I come in? No. Rachel, please. Say what you came to say from there. He rubbed his face. Whatever you found, whatever you think you found, you don't understand the whole situation. Then explain it to me. It's not that simple. It's a yes or no question, Daniel. Did you take money that wasn't yours and put my name on it? He didn't answer right away. I was going to pay it back. That's not what I asked. Rachel, if you push this, it's not just me who gets hurt. Mom, Dad, this could destroy all of us. I remember standing in that doorway, feeling something shift inside me, hard and permanent, like a door closing somewhere I couldn't see. You're telling me not to push this to protect the people who let you use my name for 2 years without telling me. It's not that black and white. It actually is. He stood there for a moment longer, like he was hoping I'd change my mind just from the weight of his silence. That had worked on me before, more times than I wanted to admit. Growing up, Daniel's silences had always meant something: disappointment, hurt feelings, a wound I was supposed to feel responsible for closing. This time, I just waited. Eventually, he said, "You're really going to do this?" I already did it. I just haven't told you what it is yet. He left without another word. I closed the door, locked it, and sat on my kitchen floor for a long time, the same way I had sat on the floor of that storage unit 2 days earlier. Because that visit told me something the documents alone hadn't. Daniel wasn't scared I had misunderstood the situation. He was scared I understood it perfectly. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. My mother called. "Can we talk?" I almost laughed. "We've talked. I mean privately." "No. Rachel, please. Where's Dad?" "At home." "Where's Daniel?" She hesitated. "Why?" "Because if we're going to talk, I want everyone there." She agreed. We met at my father's house. This time, there was no dinner, no candles, no wine, just documents spread across the kitchen table. My father looked exhausted. Daniel looked angry. My mother looked frightened. I placed the forensic report on the table. Nobody touched it. Then I placed Grandma's letter beside it. My father's face changed when he saw it. "Where did you get that?" "She gave it to me." "When?" "Before she died." He sat down. Daniel stared at the floor. My mother began crying. I looked at her. "Who forged my signature?" Nobody answered. I asked again. "Who?" Daniel finally spoke. "I did." The room went silent. I felt like the floor had moved. "You?" He nodded. "I didn't mean for it to become this. You forged my signature. I was trying to keep the company alive. With Grandma's money? She would have wanted me to have it." "No." He looked at me. "You don't know that. I have her letter." He looked away. I turned toward my father. "Did you know?" He didn't answer. "Did you know Daniel was using Grandma's money?" "Some of it." "Some." My voice rose. "How much?" My father closed his eyes. "I knew about the first transfer." "How much?" 62,000. I stared at him. "And you said nothing." "I thought Daniel would pay it back." "When?" "I don't know." I turned to my mother. Her hands were shaking. I remembered the letter. Someone broke a promise to Grandma before she died. "Mom." She looked up. "Did you ask Grandma for money before she died?" The room went very still. My father looked at her. Daniel looked at her. For the first time all night, everyone in that room was looking at the same person, and it wasn't Daniel. My mother's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Once." When? 6 months before she died. For what? Daniel's company was already struggling. I asked her to help him. She said no. I felt the floor shift again. She said no to you. Yes. And that's when this started. My mother didn't answer, which was its own answer. Because if Grandma had already refused, in writing, to fund Daniel's company before she died, then every transfer afterward wasn't a son quietly borrowing from a general family pool. It was a family deliberately overriding a dying woman's final wish and using my name to make it look legal. I looked at my mother. You knew she said no. And you helped him take it anyway. I thought I was protecting the family. You were protecting Daniel. He's my son. I'm your daughter. She didn't have an answer for that either. Daniel interrupted. I didn't steal. You forged my signature. I borrowed it. I stared at him. You don't borrow someone's identity. He slammed his hand against the table. You have no idea what I was dealing with. Then you should have told me. You would have judged me. I would have. He laughed bitterly. Exactly. I looked at him. Yes, Daniel. I would have judged you. But I wouldn't have helped you steal from Grandma after she said no to your face. He went quiet. Then my mother said something that I will never forget. We thought if you paid the bill, we could fix everything. I looked at her. Everything. The wedding. The wedding. Emily's wedding was already paid for. I froze. What? My mother looked at the floor. The money for the wedding came from the same account. I understood. The $38,742 wasn't an unpaid wedding bill. It had already been paid months earlier with money that was never theirs to spend. They wanted me to reimburse them. They wanted me to unknowingly replace money that had already been taken from the estate and to do it in a way that would make the paperwork look like I had agreed to the account all along. I looked at Emily. She was crying. Did you know? She shook her head. I knew there was family money. Did you know it was Grandma's? No. Did you know my name was on the account? No. I believed her. But that didn't make it hurt less. Because she had still sat at the table. She had still watched them hand me the bill. She had still remained silent. I looked at all of them. You didn't invite me to dinner because you missed me. Nobody spoke. You invited me because you needed a signature. Silence. You wanted me to pay money I didn't owe so you could make your books look clean. My father whispered. That's not fair. I laughed. Fair. I picked up the bill. What's fair about this? I held it up. 3 years of silence. I dropped it on the table. A fake signature. Another document. Grandma's money taken after she said no. Another. And now a $38,000 bill for a wedding I wasn't even invited to. I looked at my mother. You didn't invite your daughter to dinner. I looked at Daniel. You invited your liability. Then I left. This time, nobody told me not to come back. Because they knew I wouldn't. The legal process lasted 11 months. It was ugly. There were depositions, bank records, forensic reports, witnesses, emails, old messages. My family tried to argue that Daniel had acted alone. Then they tried to say I had verbally agreed to help. Then they said Grandma had intended the money for the business. Every explanation collapsed under the records. The estate ledger showed otherwise. Grandma had specifically prohibited the use of the trust for personal business expenses, a clause her attorney confirmed she added 6 months before her death, the same month my mother said she'd asked and been refused. The forged signatures were documented. The transfers were documented. The hotel and wedding payments were documented. And then Michael found something I hadn't expected. The original wedding contract. Emily's wedding venue had been paid from an account controlled by Daniel. The payment was made 6 months before the dinner. The $38,742 invoice was not a debt. It was a reimbursement request. They had already spent the money. They wanted me to replace it, and in doing so, retroactively make the fraud disappear under my name instead of theirs. That was the moment I stopped hoping for an apology. Because an apology would not change the fact that they had planned it carefully over months, with a folder, a dinner, candles, and my mother's smile. This wasn't an emotional family argument. It was a strategy. They had waited 3 years. They had allowed me to disappear. Then they had called me back the exact moment they needed something. And they had wrapped the request in a family dinner. That was the part that hurt most. Not the money, the performance, the candles, the china, my mother's smile. The empty years erased for one evening because they needed something from me. I thought about Grandma. Paper remembers better than people. She had been right. Every lie they told had left a document behind. Every secret had a transaction. Every betrayal had a date. Every forged signature had a pattern. And every time they told me I was imagining things, the paperwork quietly disagreed. Daniel eventually admitted everything. He had started the construction company after losing money on a failed investment. Grandma had refused to give him money. My mother's confession confirmed that refusal had a date, a reason, and a paper trail of her own. So Daniel convinced himself that borrowing from the estate was temporary. The first transfer was $62,000. Then another. Then another. When he couldn't repay the first one, he moved more money to cover the gap. My father discovered it early. Instead of reporting him, he helped hide it. My mother, who had asked Grandma directly and been told no, chose to look the other way once her son found another way to get the money regardless. And then, when I started asking questions, they decided I was the threat. Daniel had forged my signature because my name had been placed on one of Grandma's estate accounts. They thought using my name would make the transactions appear legitimate. When the estate records were challenged, they needed the account to be reconciled. That's where the wedding came in. They used estate money to pay Emily's wedding expenses. Then they created the bill. The plan was simple. I would come to dinner. They would tell me that because I was part of the family account, I was responsible. I would feel guilty, maybe angry. But eventually, they believed I would pay. And once I paid, the money would go into the account. The paper trail would look cleaner. They had calculated everything. Except me. They had forgotten one thing. I had spent 3 years learning how to live without them. I didn't need their approval anymore. That was the one thing they couldn't take from me. The court eventually ordered Daniel to repay the estate. He was charged with financial fraud and identity-related offenses. My father wasn't charged with the same offenses, but he was required to cooperate with the investigation. My mother had to provide records and testify. Emily's wedding expenses were reviewed, and during that review, I finally saw photographs from the day itself for the first time, pulled into evidence not to hurt me, but because the venue's invoice needed to be matched against the actual event. I hadn't let myself look for photos before that. I'd told myself I didn't want to know what I'd missed. But sitting in Michael's office, going through an exhibit binder, I found myself looking at pictures of my sister in a white dress, surrounded by people I recognized. Standing at an altar I would have driven 4 hours to see in person if anyone had simply told me it was happening. There was a seating chart in the exhibit too, printed and laminated, listing every table and every guest. My name wasn't crossed out or removed. It simply wasn't there at all, as if there had never been a version of the plan that included me. Not an argument. Not a debate about whether to invite the estranged daughter. Just a clean, uncomplicated absence, decided somewhere in a conversation I was never part of. That was the moment the case stopped feeling like it was only about money. Because you can put a dollar figure on a wedding venue, on catering, on flowers. You can't put one on the version of that day where I was standing somewhere in those photographs instead of finding out, 18 months later, in a lawyer's office, what my own sister had looked like on her wedding day. I asked Michael afterward why the seating chart mattered legally. He said it didn't, particularly. It wasn't going to move the fraud case one way or the other. Then why did you show it to me? Because I thought you should see it on your own terms, in a room where you had someone next to you, instead of stumbling across it by accident someday on someone else's social media. I've thought a lot about the day you asked me who forged your signature, and I said nothing. I keep coming back to that. Not the money. Not even Daniel. Just the fact that my daughter asked me a direct question across a table, and I looked at her and said nothing, because saying something honest would have cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. What would it have cost you? The version of myself who still believed he'd raised a family that looked out for each other. I think some part of me had known for over a year what Daniel was doing, and I let myself believe it wasn't as bad as it looked, because looking at it honestly would have meant admitting I'd failed you and Emily both, in different ways. for a long time before that dinner ever happened. I didn't say anything. I let him keep talking, because I think it was the first fully honest thing my father had said to me in years, and I didn't want to interrupt it. Your mother asked Grandma for that money herself, you know, before she asked me to help hide the transfers. I think she's spent every day since telling herself a version of events where that isn't true, or where it doesn't matter as much as it does. I can't keep doing that. Not after watching you sit across from a courtroom and prove, piece by piece, everything we tried to tell you wasn't real. Why are you telling me this now, Dad? Not during the trial. Not at the dinner. Now. He was quiet for a moment. Because I don't think I get to ask you to trust me again. I understand that. But I didn't want you carrying this alone, thinking maybe you'd been too hard on all of us. You weren't. If anything, you gave us far more chances to tell the truth than we deserved. That call didn't fix anything between us. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes get told as if one good conversation repairs years of damage, and that's not how it actually works. It's a family expense. You always make everything about money. You're destroying this family. Notice that none of those statements answered a single question I asked. Every one of them redirected the conversation from what they had done to what I was allegedly doing by asking. This is a pattern some psychologists describe using the acronym DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. Deny the wrongdoing. Attack the person raising it. Reverse the roles so the accuser starts to look like the aggressor. My mother didn't defend the forged signature. She never even tried. She simply pivoted, immediately and fluently, to accusing me of destroying the family by asking about it. That fluency is what told me, more than anything else, that this wasn't the first time she'd used that line. It was rehearsed. It had probably worked on someone else in the family long before it was aimed at me. The fifth tactic, and maybe the cruelest one, was timing the return of affection to the moment they needed something. 3 years of silence ended not with an apology, but with a request. That's not an accident. It's a demonstration of exactly how conditional the relationship had always been. Real reconciliation doesn't usually arrive wrapped around an invoice. If someone reappears in your life only when they need something from you, the reappearance itself is information. It tells you what the relationship was actually built on the whole time. I'm not sharing this to turn my family into a case study for entertainment. I'm sharing it because I spent years wondering if I was the problem, if I was too sensitive, too suspicious, too quick to see manipulation where there was only misunderstanding. It took a forensic document examiner and 11 months of litigation to prove, on paper, what I had already felt in my body the moment my mother slid that folder across the table. Looking back now, I can see exactly what was done to me that night, step by step, like a recipe. And I think it's worth breaking down, because I know some of you watching this have sat at a table just like mine. The first tactic was the setup. They didn't call. They texted. 6 words, no explanation, an instruction to come alone. That single detail, please come alone, should have been my first warning. Isolation is one of the oldest tools in manipulation. Not physical isolation, necessarily, but informational isolation. If I had brought a friend, a partner, anyone outside the family, there would have been a witness who wasn't already committed to the story. They needed me alone in a room full of people who had already agreed on the script. The second tactic was the performance. The candles. The good china. The wine. None of that was about celebration. It was about disarming me before the real conversation started. 20 minutes of small talk about the weather and Dad's garden wasn't kindness. It was a warm-up designed to lower my guard, to make the eventual ask feel like it was coming from a place of normalcy instead of calculation. This is sometimes called love bombing in reverse. Not overwhelming affection to win trust, but a controlled, familiar atmosphere designed to make an unreasonable request feel reasonable by association. The third tactic was the folder itself and the order in which it was revealed. They didn't open with, "We forged your signature." They opened with an invoice. A number. Something that looked bureaucratic, almost boring, easy to accept without asking where it came from. This is a classic anchoring technique. Give someone a large, specific, official-looking number first, and the instinct is to negotiate around that number rather than to question its legitimacy at all. They were hoping I would ask, "Can I pay in installments?" instead of, "Why does this exist?" The fourth tactic was guilt, layered directly on top of confusion. Grandma's roses, the ones she used to complain took too much water and refused to stop planting anyway, were still growing along the fence, a little wild now, a little overgrown, but unmistakably hers. I stood outside for a long time. A woman came out onto the porch at one point, maybe wondering why a stranger was parked across from her house for 15 minutes. I gave her a small wave and told her I used to know the family that lived there. She smiled, said the garden had come with the house, and went back inside. She had no idea what that garden had cost. I remembered sitting at Grandma's kitchen table. The blue folder. The tea. Her hand over mine. Don't let them convince you that silence is the same thing as peace. I finally understood what she meant, in a way I hadn't fully understood even during the trial. Silence can look peaceful. A family can sit around a table without shouting. People can smile. They can serve dinner. They can raise their glasses. They can say, "We're family," and still be hurting each other in ways that don't show up until someone finally opens the folder nobody else wanted opened. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. Sometimes peace requires confrontation. Sometimes it requires saying no in a room full of people who have already decided what your answer should be. Sometimes it requires walking away from a dinner table with candles still lit behind you. I never got the $38,742 bill again. The court made sure of that. But I kept a copy. Not because I wanted to remember the money. I kept it because it reminds me of the exact night I stopped measuring my worth by whether my family accepted me. That dinner was supposed to make me feel guilty. Instead, it gave me the evidence I needed to set myself free. When Daniel's sentencing was read, he didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, the same way he had at that dinner table, the same way he had his entire life whenever a version of himself he didn't like was placed directly in front of him. My mother sat 2 rows behind him, and she did look at me once, briefly, before looking away again. I don't know what was in that look. I've thought about it more times than I'd like to admit. Some days I decide it was regret. Other days I decide it was something closer to resentment, like she still believed, somewhere underneath everything, that none of this would have happened if I had simply paid the bill and stayed quiet. I think that's the part that took me the longest to accept. Not that they had lied to me. Not that they had used my name. But that even after all of it, the forensic reports, the testimony, the court order, some part of my mother still believed the real mistake had been mine, for refusing to disappear quietly. I had to learn to live with the fact that some people will never fully understand why you left, because understanding would require them to admit what they did to make you go. 3 years after the dinner, I went back to Grandma's house. It had been sold not long after the estate was finally settled. I hadn't planned to go. I was driving to a client meeting on the other side of town, and the old route, the one I used to take every Sunday as a kid, was faster because of construction on the main road. I didn't even realize where I was until I was already parked across the street, staring at a house that no longer fully belonged to the family that had once fought so hard over it. The new owners had renovated the kitchen. The old dining room, the one with the yellow legal pad and the 2 cups of tea and the thick blue folder, was gone. Repainted, refurnished, filled with someone else's life. The wallpaper had been removed. But the front garden was still there. Just 2 sisters trying to figure out whether something broken could become something different. Daniel was another story. He wrote to me from a rehabilitation program after his conviction. I never responded. Maybe one day I will. Maybe I won't. Some relationships don't need immediate closure. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is leave the ending unfinished. I want to tell you about the day the verdict came, because it wasn't the moment I expected it to be. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel vindicated. Instead, I sat in a courtroom hallway on a plastic chair, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and I felt almost nothing at all. Michael found me there after the judge dismissed the room for a recess. "You okay?" "I don't know." He sat down next to me. "That's normal." "Is it?" People think closure feels like winning. It usually just feels like exhaustion. I looked at him. Then what was the point of any of it? He was quiet for a moment. "The point was that the record is correct now." Whatever you feel about it, the truth is written down. Nobody can quietly rewrite this story anymore. I thought about that for a long time after we left the courthouse. Because that was the thing my family had been counting on from the very beginning, that if enough time passed, if enough silence accumulated, the story would simply become whatever they said it was. Linda had held the family together. Daniel had struggled and been misunderstood. Rachel had been difficult, had asked too many questions, had walked away for no good reason. That was the version they would have told at every future holiday, every future wedding, every future funeral, for the rest of their lives, if I had never opened that folder. Instead, there was a record now. A permanent one. Filed with a court, signed by a judge, supported by a forensic report that couldn't be argued away over Thanksgiving dinner. We still don't have the relationship we had before any of this happened. I don't know if we ever will. But it was the first time in 3 years that someone in my family had told me the truth without me having to drag it out of a bank statement first. And for a long time, that was enough. 8 months after the dinner, I received a letter from my mother. Not a text. Not a phone call. A letter. She wrote for 6 pages. She apologized. She said she had been afraid. She said she had convinced herself that keeping the family together justified lying. She admitted that she had known about Daniel's first transfer. She admitted that she had helped create the dinner plan. And then she wrote something that I hadn't expected. You were right to leave. I read that sentence several times. She didn't ask me to come home. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She simply said, I don't expect you to trust me again. I only wanted you to know that I finally understand why you stopped answering. I folded the letter. I didn't respond. Not because I hated her. Because I wasn't ready. There is a difference between forgiveness and access. I learned that the hard way. You can forgive someone and still keep the door closed. You can love someone and still refuse to let them control your life. You can miss your family and still understand that distance is sometimes the safest form of peace. A year later, Emily called me. She was crying. I should have told you. I knew what she meant. The dinner. Yes. Why didn't you? I was scared. Of Mom. Of losing everyone. I understood. Because I had once been afraid of the same thing. What do you want from me? Nothing. She paused. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I accepted the apology. But I didn't pretend everything was normal. It wasn't. We met for coffee. Then again. Slowly. Carefully. No promises. No pretending. I've thought a lot about the day you asked me who forged your signature, and I said nothing. I keep coming back to that. Not the money. Not even Daniel. Just the fact that my daughter asked me a direct question across a table, and I looked at her and said nothing, because saying something honest would have cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. What would it have cost you? The version of myself who still believed he'd raised a family that looked out for each other. I think some part of me had known for over a year what Daniel was doing, and I let myself believe it wasn't as bad as it looked, because looking at it honestly would have meant admitting I'd failed you and Emily both, in different ways, for a long time before that dinner ever happened. I didn't say anything. I let him keep talking, because I think it was the first fully honest thing my father had said to me in years, and I didn't want to interrupt it. Your mother asked Grandma for that money herself, you know. Before she asked me to help hide the transfers. I think she's spent every day since telling herself a version of events where that isn't true, or where it doesn't matter as much as it does. I can't keep doing that. Not after watching you sit across from a courtroom and prove, piece by piece, everything we tried to tell you wasn't real. Why are you telling me this now, Dad? Not during the trial. Not at the dinner. Now. He was quiet for a moment. Because I don't think I get to ask you to trust me again. I understand that. But I didn't want you carrying this alone, thinking maybe you'd been too hard on all of us. You weren't. If anything, you gave us far more chances to tell the truth than we deserved. That call didn't fix anything between us. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes get told as if one good conversation repairs years of damage, and that's not how it actually works. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes your brain laughs when reality becomes too absurd to process. Pay what? The bill. I can see that. It's a family expense. No. My mother blinked. What? I said no. The room became completely silent. My father leaned forward. Rachel, don't make this difficult. I looked at him. You invited me here after 3 years of not speaking to me, handed me a $38,000 bill, and you're surprised I'm asking questions? My mother reached for the folder. We're not asking you to pay the whole thing immediately. I stared at her. That's not what I asked. She hesitated. The bill is connected to the wedding. Whose wedding? Emily looked at me. Mine. I turned toward my sister. You got married? She lowered her eyes. 6 months ago. I felt something inside me go very still. 6 months. I had been excluded from my own sister's wedding. And now they wanted me to pay for it. I pushed the folder back across the table. You have the wrong person. My father shook his head. No, we don't. You invited me to dinner to collect money for a wedding I wasn't invited to? My mother said quietly. You were invited. I stared at her. No, I wasn't. You were. Mom, I didn't receive an invitation. It was sent. Where? She didn't answer. Daniel finally spoke. It was complicated. I turned toward him. What's complicated about mailing an invitation? Nobody answered. And that's when I understood something that changed the entire tone of the evening. The bill wasn't the real reason they had called me. The bill was only the thing they wanted me to see first. There was something else in that folder. Something they were afraid to tell me, something so buried in paperwork that they were counting on me never finding it. But I did. I reached for the folder again. And this time I opened every page. If something in your gut tells you a room has been set up around a version of events you're expected to accept without question, trust that feeling. Ask for the paperwork. Ask for the dates. Ask who benefits if you stay quiet. Because in my experience, the people who need you to stay quiet are rarely protecting you. They're protecting themselves. People sometimes ask me what the hardest part of that year was, expecting me to say it was the depositions, or the forensic reports, or sitting across a courtroom from my own brother. It wasn't any of those. The hardest part was the ordinary Tuesday, 6 weeks after the dinner, when I realized I had nobody to call. I had spent so many years, even during the silence, holding on to a quiet assumption that if something truly terrible happened to me, my family would still show up. That the estrangement was somehow temporary, reversible, a wound that could still close if enough time passed. That assumption had been doing more work in my life than I realized. It was the invisible floor underneath everything else, the job stress, the failed relationships, the late nights wondering if I'd made the right call 3 years earlier. Underneath all of it was the belief that if things got bad enough, blood would still mean something. The forensic report ended that assumption for good, and I wasn't prepared for how much that would hurt, even though I already knew, logically, exactly what they had done. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I started building a different kind of family, on purpose, instead of waiting for the one I was born into to come back. I called an old college roommate, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year because I'd been too embarrassed to explain why my family had gone quiet. I told her everything, start to finish, sitting in her kitchen with 2 cups of tea, the same way I used to sit in Grandma's kitchen. She didn't ask why I hadn't told her sooner. She just listened, and then she said the one thing I hadn't let myself hear from anyone in 3 years. None of that was your fault. I cried for 20 minutes straight, the kind of crying that comes from relief rather than grief. I started seeing a therapist, not because I thought I was falling apart, but because I realized I had spent 3 years treating estrangement like a wound I had to manage silently, on my own, without ever actually processing what it had done to me. We talked about the difference between being estranged from people and being estranged from the idea of them. The version of my mother I kept hoping still existed underneath the woman who slid a fraudulent invoice across a dinner table. I moved apartments that year too, mostly for work, but I remember standing in the new place on the first night, boxes still unopened, and feeling something I hadn't expected. Lightness. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But the specific relief of no longer carrying a hope that kept getting used against me. Emily and I kept meeting for coffee, slowly building something new instead of trying to rebuild something that had already shown me exactly what it was capable of. She told me things about growing up in that house that I'd never fully understood from my angle, how much pressure she'd felt to keep the peace, how often she'd watched Daniel get protected from consequences that anyone else would have faced immediately. We didn't excuse each other. We just started to actually see each other, maybe for the first time as adults instead of as roles assigned by birth order and family mythology. My father tried to reach out once, about a year after the sentencing. A short email. No apology, not really, mostly a request that I not be so hard on your mother. She's suffered enough. I didn't respond to that one either. Some emails don't deserve a response. Some are just one more attempt to manage the story instead of taking responsibility for it. I think a lot of people expect estrangement stories to end in one of two ways. Either everyone reconciles and hugs it out at the end, or the estranged person ends up permanently alone, bitter, isolated. Neither of those happened to me. What happened instead was quieter, and I think more honest. I ended up with a smaller circle. A few relationships rebuilt carefully on new terms, with clear boundaries instead of unspoken obligations. A few relationships left permanently closed, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And a version of peace that didn't depend on everyone at that dinner table agreeing to tell the truth about what they'd done. I haven't told you about the cross-examination yet, and I think you need to hear it, because it was the moment I came closest to doubting myself in the entire 11 months. Daniel's defense attorney was a sharp, soft-spoken man named Peter Hollis. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. On the second day of my testimony, he stood, buttoned his jacket, and asked a question that had clearly been designed weeks in advance. Miss Ellis, isn't it true that you and your brother had a strained relationship long before any of these transactions occurred? We had disagreements. Like most siblings. Isn't it also true that you were, in your own words, quote, always asking too many questions in this family? I felt my pulse pick up. That's what my mother called it. I called it wanting honest answers. So you'd agree you had a pattern of suspicion toward your family's finances. I'd agree I had a pattern of asking where my grandmother's money went. Yes. And isn't it possible, Miss Ellis, that in your eagerness to find wrongdoing, you misread ordinary family financial arrangements as something more sinister? I looked at him for a moment before answering. I didn't misread a forensic document examiner's report. I didn't misread the account transfer dated the same week my grandmother died. And I didn't forge my own signature, Mr. Hollis. Someone else did that part for me. There was a small ripple of reaction in the courtroom. Not dramatic. Just the sound of a room noticing that a question meant to unsettle a witness had landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Hollis tried a different angle. You were estranged from your family for 3 years prior to this dinner, correct? Yes. Isn't it possible that estrangement colored your interpretation of an innocent request to help with a family expense? With respect, I wasn't estranged because I misinterpreted anything. I was estranged because I asked a question 3 years ago that nobody in my family wanted to answer. The same question, it turns out, that this entire trial has now answered for me. He didn't ask another question about my credibility after that. I remember Michael leaning toward me afterward, during a recess, and saying quietly, "That's the moment the jury stopped seeing you as the difficult daughter and started seeing you as the only person in that family who'd been telling the truth the whole time." I don't know if that's exactly what shifted the case. Trials are complicated, and there were weeks of forensic testimony, bank records, and expert analysis that mattered far more than any single exchange on a witness stand. But I remember that moment specifically, because it was the first time in years that someone had tried to make me sound irrational for asking questions, and I hadn't flinched. 3 years of silence had taught me exactly how to answer that kind of question without doubting myself. They had spent 3 years training me, without meaning to survive the exact thing they eventually tried to do to me in that courtroom. Aunt Susan and I talk now, more than we ever did when I was growing up. She called me a few weeks after her deposition, and the first thing she said was, "I should have called you 3 years ago." "Why didn't you?" "Because your mother told me you'd cut yourself off from the family, and I believed her instead of asking you directly." I understood that more than she probably expected me to. It's easy, from the outside, to accept the version of events that requires the least effort, the version that doesn't ask you to question someone you've known your whole life. "Why did you agree to come to that dinner?" She was quiet for a moment. "Honestly? Curiosity at first. Your mother made it sound like a peace offering. Then I got there and watched you walk in, and I watched everyone's faces when that folder came out, and I realized none of you looked surprised except you. That's when I understood it wasn't a peace offering. It was an ambush, and I'd been invited to help make it look legitimate. Why didn't you say anything that night? Because I was a coward, Rachel. I sat there and told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your mother's relationship with her own daughter. But watching someone hand you a bill for a wedding you weren't invited to, and calling it family loyalty, that wasn't a private family matter. That was just wrong, and I knew it in real time, and I didn't say a word. She paused. I'm sorry it took a subpoena for me to finally say something useful. I told her the same thing I eventually told Emily. I wasn't interested in punishing people forever for the version of themselves that stayed silent at that table. I was interested in whether they were willing to be different now, with nothing to gain from it anymore. Susan has been different. She calls. She asks real questions and waits for real answers. She never once, in all our conversations since, tried to explain away what happened, or asked me to make peace with my mother faster than I was ready to. My Uncle Robert, the one who always made every conversation about his own success, reacted the way I probably should have expected. He didn't call. He didn't testify beyond what a subpoena required. When a mutual cousin asked him what he thought about the whole situation, he reportedly said, "Families go through things. It'll blow over." It didn't blow over. It went to trial, and it ended with a conviction and a divided estate, and Robert attended none of it, sent no messages, offered no opinion beyond the one comfortable enough not to require him to choose a side. I used to think his silence was neutrality. Now I understand it was its own kind of choice, the choice to let a family keep hurting one of its own members rather than risk an uncomfortable conversation at the next holiday. Neutrality, when someone you love is being harmed in front of you, usually isn't neutral at all. It's just a quieter way of choosing the side that's easier to stand next to. I don't think about Robert often anymore. There wasn't a dramatic falling out between us, because there wasn't much of a relationship to fall out of in the first place. He simply confirmed, in his own understated way, what I'd already learned from everyone else at that table, that some people will let you carry the entire weight of a family's dishonesty by yourself, as long as carrying it means they never have to. That's the thing I've come to notice about the people worth keeping in your life after something like this happens. They don't need you to move on for their comfort. They let you move at your own pace, and they show up anyway. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had simply paid. Maybe they would have thanked me. Maybe the family would have stayed together for another year on the surface, in the way families do when everyone has quietly agreed not to mention the things sitting underneath every conversation. Maybe everyone would have gone on pretending nothing had happened. Maybe I would have spent the rest of my life wondering why the numbers never quite added up, telling myself I was being paranoid every time the thought crossed my mind. Maybe I would have kept believing I was the difficult daughter, the selfish sister, the person who couldn't let things go. But I didn't pay. I asked questions. And that's what changed everything. Because there are moments in life when people don't need you to be kind. They need you to be clear. There are moments when saying yes isn't generosity. It's surrender. And there are moments when saying no isn't cruelty. It's the first honest thing you've said in years. My family wanted me to pay a $38,000 bill. Instead, I paid something else. I paid the price of walking away. The price of being misunderstood. The price of losing people I loved. The price of spending holidays alone that first year, before I learned how to build a life that didn't revolve around a table I was no longer welcome at. The price of hearing distant relatives say I had destroyed the family, without ever once asking me why I'd left. But that price was temporary. The price of silence would have been permanent. Because if I had signed that document, if I had paid that bill, if I had accepted their version of the story, I would have spent the rest of my life helping them bury the truth, one holiday dinner at a time. And Grandma had spent her final months trying to make sure that never happened. She couldn't protect the money forever. Money, it turns out, is easy to move, easy to hide, easy to argue about in court for 11 months. But she protected the truth long enough for me to find it, sitting in a storage unit I had nearly forgotten, in a folder that had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment. That was her final gift. Not the inheritance. Not the house. Not the account. the truth, and the instructions for how to find it if no one else was willing to tell me. I think that's what she wanted me to understand all along, back when she sat across from me at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us. Family isn't the people who share your last name. Family isn't the people who demand your loyalty while giving you none in return. Family isn't the people who tell you to stay quiet because the truth would embarrass them at Thanksgiving. Family is the people who can hear the truth about themselves and still choose to do better without being forced into it by a court order. My grandmother understood that. I didn't. Not until that dinner. Not until the folder. Not until the $38,742.16. And not until I realized the most important number in this entire story was never written on the bill. It was the number of years I had spent believing I needed their permission to protect myself. 3 years of silence. 3 years of birthdays missed. 3 years of holidays without them. 3 years of wondering whether I had made the right decision. And then one dinner, one folder, and one forensic report changed everything. They thought they were bringing me back into the family. They were actually giving me the final reason to leave it, and the evidence I needed to make sure they could never quietly rewrite what they'd done. Today, I still have my grandmother's blue folder. It's in a locked drawer in my desk, not because I need the documents anymore. The court has certified copies of everything now, but because I want to remember the woman who knew her own family well enough to prepare for exactly what they might become. On the first page of her letter, she wrote my name. On the last page, she wrote something I think about almost every single day. Whatever happens, choose the truth over the appearance of peace. I finally did. And I have never regretted it. At the beginning of this story, I asked you a question. If your family cut you off for 3 years and then called you out of nowhere with 6 words, dinner tonight. We need to talk. Would you go? I went. And I'm not going to tell you that going was the right choice for everyone in every situation, because I don't believe there's one universal right answer to a question like that. What I will tell you is what I wish someone had told me before I sat down at that table. If you ever find yourself back in a room with people who cut you off, watch for these 5 things, because they're the exact things I missed the first 20 minutes of that dinner, and I don't want you to miss them too. First, notice who isn't surprised. If something shocking gets revealed and half the room reacts and half the room doesn't even flinch, the people who don't flinch already knew. That's your guest list for who is in on it. Second, notice the order things are revealed in. If the ask comes wrapped in small talk, candles, and comfort food before anyone tells you why you're really there, that's not warmth. That's a setup designed to lower your guard before the real conversation starts. Third, notice what happens when you ask a direct question and get a non-answer. It's complicated. You know what you did. Don't make this difficult. None of those are answers. They're deflections dressed up as answers, and the more of them you hear in a row, the more certain you can be that a direct answer would hurt whoever's avoiding it. Fourth, notice whether the timing of their sudden affection lines up suspiciously well with something they need from you. Real reconciliation rarely arrives with an invoice attached. If the warmth shows up exactly when a request does, ask yourself honestly which one came first in their planning. Fifth, and this is the one that matters most, notice how you feel in your own body, not just what you're being told to feel. I felt something was wrong the second I walked through that door and saw 6 place settings and candles for a dinner nobody had bothered to explain. I spent the next 20 minutes talking myself out of that feeling because everyone around me was smiling. Don't do what I did. Trust the feeling before the room talks you out of it. I'm not sharing any of this so you'll go looking for manipulation in every family gathering you're ever invited to again. Most dinners are just dinners. Most invitations really are just an invitation. But some aren't. And the only way to tell the difference is to trust yourself enough to ask the uncomfortable question, especially when everyone at the table is hoping you won't. My grandmother spent the last months of her life preparing a folder for a moment she hoped would never come. I hope you never need one either. But if you do, I hope you have the courage to open it, read every page, and choose the truth, even when the truth costs you people you loved. Because in the end, that's the only bill that was ever actually worth paying. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that first dinner, the candles, the china, My mother standing up and smiling like nothing had happened in 3 years. I think about how close I came to sitting through the whole evening, feeling the guilt they wanted me to feel, and quietly writing a check just to make the discomfort stop. I think about how easy it would have been. Guilt is efficient that way. It doesn't ask you to think. It just asks you to comply quickly, before the feeling gets any worse. What saved me wasn't courage, exactly. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people watching stories like this sometimes assume the person in my position must have been fearless the entire time, certain of themselves, unshakable. I wasn't. My hands were shaking under that table the entire time I was flipping through that folder. Part of me wanted, more than almost anything, to just agree, to smooth things over, to have my family back even if having them back meant pretending none of it had happened. What saved me was a habit my grandmother had built into me years earlier, one conversation at a time, without either of us realizing what it would eventually be used for. She taught me to ask for the paperwork. Not because she expected this exact scenario. I don't think anyone can fully predict the shape their own family's worst version of itself will eventually take. But she understood something true about people in general, that the difference between a lie and the truth almost always shows up somewhere on paper, eventually, if you're patient enough and stubborn enough to go looking for it. So if there's one thing I hope you take from this story, more than the details of the fraud, more than the courtroom, more than the 11 months of depositions, it's this. Trust the paper. Ask for the dates. Compare the signature. And if someone you love asks you to accept a version of events without evidence, without documents, without a straight answer to a direct question, remember that love doesn't usually need you to stop asking questions. Only secrets do. If this story meant something to you, or reminded you of a table you've sat at yourself, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because this isn't the only family that handed someone a bill instead of an apology, and it won't be the last story I tell about what happens when someone finally decides to open the folder.